The chill that clung to the stonework of St. Jude's Asylum was not merely the cold of late autumn. It was the persistent, burrowing cold of neglect, a thermal quality that seemed to radiate from the very heart of the building's despair. Elias, who had counted 11 years and countless hours spent staring at peeling wallpaper, knew this cold intimately. It lived in his chest, a small, hard knot of unresolved sorrow. Tonight, however, a different heat fueled him, the heat of absolute, desperate urgency. He moved through the dormitory corridor with the practiced weightlessness of a creature born to silence. The floorboards, ancient cypress planks that usually screamed under the slightest pressure, remained unnervingly quiet beneath the thick, doubled socks he wore. Each shadow was a familiar friend, especially the massive, elongated shape cast by the linen cupboard, which tonight served as his temporary hiding place, while the matron, Mrs. Prudence, conducted her final, dragging patrol. The air smelled of disinfectant, cheap soap, and the faint, sweet decay of old wood smoke escaping the furnace vents. Elias clutched the single piece of evidence that had driven him to this perilous breach of the asylum's strictest rule: a photograph. It was not a grand or meaningful image, simply a hastily developed snapshot found tucked beneath a loose floor tile in the attic library. The picture showed a man, indistinct and smiling, standing beside a colossal instrument of brass and glass. Above the man, etched into the dome of a high ceiling, was a peculiar stylized star cluster. That star cluster was identical to the one carved high above the main entrance of the Aetheria Tower. The Aetheria Tower, the Forbidden Observatory. It loomed 50 yards from the asylum's main wing, a circular stack of blackened granite crowned by a gigantic hemisphere of patinated copper and segmented glass. It was forbidden not because of structural danger or institutional decree, but because of its sheer, heavy silence. It had been sealed off for decades, a monument to a science and a past St. Jude's wished to forget. Mrs. Prudence's heavy footsteps finally faded, replaced only by the faint, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock down the main hall, a sound that always seemed to measure not time, but waiting. Elias exhaled, a long, careful release of breath that left a visible puff of steam in the hallway's arid air. His inventory was minimal. The photograph, carefully folded and tucked into the inside pocket of his too large shirt. A small flat piece of lead he had scraped from a pipe, useful for wedging, and crucially, a length of frayed but sturdy hemp rope salvaged from the laundry pulley. His destination required him to leave the building, cross the open, frozen grounds, and breach the sealed structure. He reached the heavy oak door leading to the service stairwell. It was secured by a deadbolt, not a lock, a simple, intimidating bar of iron that slid horizontally into the frame. Elias slipped the lead wedge into the tiny gap between the door and the frame, high up near the bolt housing. He applied slow, sustained pressure, pushing until the lead itself began to compress, spreading the gap by a hair's breadth. The metal groaned, a deep, resonant sound like a whale sighing beneath the ocean. He held his breath, listening for any shift in the pervasive silence. Nothing. The sound had been absorbed by the heavy stonework. With the gap widened, he manipulated the rope. He had tied a fine loop at the end, stiffened slightly with wax stolen from a candle stub. He threaded this loop through the gap, aiming for the knob of the deadbolt. This required an excruciating 10 minutes of blind fishing, his fingers trembling not from cold, but from the adrenaline saturating his small frame. Lick-thunk, the bolt retracted. Elias eased the door open, centimetre by agonizing centimetre, until the gap was just wide enough for his body. He slipped through, closing the door softly behind him. The air in the stairwell was immediately colder, sharper, smelling distinctly of damp earth and disused space. He was outside. The grounds were blanketed in a fragile layer of hoarfrost that shimmered like pulverized glass beneath the weak, distant light of the half-moon. The silence here was different, vast, encompassing, interrupted only by the rustle of dead leaves clinging to the iron fence that separated the asylum grounds from the prohibited tower enclosure. The Aetheria Tower rose before him, an imposing silhouette against the pale velvet of the night sky. It looked less like a building and more like a colossal grounded spacecraft from a distant, tragic future. The fence line was simple wrought iron, but secured with a heavy chain and padlock. Elias knew, however, that years of abandonment meant the ground had shifted. He knelt by the lowest point of the fence, where the iron rails disappeared into the frozen earth. Using a shard of broken slate he had cached earlier, he began to scrape away the dirt, widening a gap beneath the lowest rail. The cold soaked through his gloves, turning his fingertips numb and clumsy. The earth resisted, hard and compacted. This was physical labor, slow and grueling, taking him nearly half an hour. His muscles burned with the static tension of controlled effort. When the gap was finally wide enough, a dusty, uneven crescent, he slid through on his stomach. The rough, frozen soil scraped against his exposed skin at the wrist and ankle. He was inside the enclosure. The air immediately changed again, becoming still, dry and heavy, with the scent of oxidized copper and decades of trapped dust. The entrance to the tower was a single, tall archway secured by a massive, twin-paneled wooden door bolted internally. Entry through the main door was impossible. Elias had long studied the structure, and he knew his only chance lay with the maintenance hatch, high up, nearly 3 stories above the ground, where the granite base met the curve of the dome structure. This hatch was meant for accessing exterior meteorological instruments, now long defunct. He approached the tower wall. The granite blocks were cold enough to burn. He located the only viable purchase, a series of ornamental gargoyles, carved into the stone at irregular intervals, whose open mouths and clawed feet offered precarious handholds. The ascent began. It was not a rapid climb. It was a deliberate, agonizing meditation on gravity and friction. Each movement was calculated, testing the solidity of the stone, the stability of the centuries-old carvings. His arms quickly fatigued, the strain pooling in his biceps and shoulders. The fear was a constant, icy weight in his stomach, not the fear of being caught, but the primitive terror of falling into the absolute darkness below. He reached the first level, clinging to the cold stone like an insect. He rested his cheek against the unforgiving granite, feeling the roughness of the rock pressing into his skin, tasting the sharp, metallic dust. He had to ignore the pain, ignore the shaking in his legs, focus only on the next grip. When he finally reached the level of the maintenance hatch, his fingers were stiff claws, unresponsive and raw. The hatch was a simple, circular disc of iron, hinged and secured by 2 large, rusting wing nuts. The lead wedge was useless here. Elias produced a thin, flattened piece of structural iron he had found near the furnace, a crude, heavy pry bar. He inserted the tip beneath the edge of the disc and pressed. The metal shrieked in protest, a sound swallowed quickly by the height and the heavy stone. The wing nuts, cemented in place by rust and time, refused to budge. He changed strategy. Instead of brute force, he focused on precision. Using the pry bar like a chisel, he began to tap carefully against the seam where the wing nut met the iron hatch, trying to break the bond of oxidation. Tap, 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 rhythmic, low, insistent. Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. Finally, with a sharp, high crack, the first nut surrendered. It fell away, hitting the stone below with a surprisingly dull thud. Elias repeated the process for the second nut. The second one came away easier, almost whispering as it detached. He used the pry bar one last time, inserting it into the seam and gently leveraging the heavy hatch inward. The hinges screamed, protesting the violation of their long rest. The hatch opened onto utter blackness. He had breached the Aetheria Tower. He pulled himself through the narrow opening, scraping his hip against the rough iron edge. He tumbled onto a narrow catwalk, inhaling a cloud of thick, cloying dust that tasted ancient and metallic. He was inside the dome. The interior was vast and terrifying. It was a space defined by echoes and sheer volume. A faint, ethereal light filtered in through the massive segmented glass panels of the dome overhead, illuminating millions of dancing dust motes that hung suspended in the stagnant air. The air was heavy, smelling of ozone, stale velvet, and the unmistakable, poignant scent of disused machinery, oils, solvents, and aged brass. He stood on a narrow metal walkway that circled the interior perimeter, designed for access to the high windows. Far below, the floor was lost in shadow, seemingly impossible to reach. The center of the dome, however, dominated everything. There it was, the instrument from the photograph, the great telescope. It stood on a massive equatorial mount, a terrifyingly intricate sculpture of engineering, polished brass contrasting sharply with dark, heavy steel. It was larger than any object Elias had ever seen, its barrel thicker than his own small torso, its intricate system of gears and counterweights looking like the preserved heart of a forgotten titan. He moved toward the instrument, his footsteps echoing eerily on the metal grating of the catwalk. Each step was a violation, and the silence seemed to press in on him, amplifying the frantic rhythm of his own pulse. The silence here wasn't empty. It was pregnant with history, with observation, and with a terrible sense of purpose. Elias reached the telescope's mounting. It was cold to the touch, transmitting the immense latent cold of the metal directly to his fingers. He ran his hand over the smooth, heavy brass of the barrel, marveling at the sheer craftsmanship. He looked for the eyepiece. It was positioned high up, requiring him to climb onto the sturdy, three-rung ladder attached to the mount's base. He ascended the 3 steps, bringing his eye level precisely to the lens. The instrument was positioned at an incredibly low angle. Instead of pointing up toward the cold, distant stars that should have been its only quarry, the barrel was aimed horizontally, piercing the vast space of the dome. Elias paused, his hand hovering over the cold metal of the fine adjustment wheel. This was wrong. Observatories looked up. He leaned in, placing his eye against the dusty lens, bracing himself against the unexpected angle. He expected to see the granite wall, perhaps the dark, empty space of the opposing walkway, or maybe, if the dome was slightly ajar, a sliver of the distant black horizon. His breath, warm and shallow, fogged the glass. He rubbed it clear with his sleeve again, shivering despite the effort. He looked again. The view snapped into focus with brutal clarity. The magnifying power of the instrument was staggering. Elias saw texture. He saw the minute structure of brick, faded red brick, speckled with lichen and patches of grey, rough mortar. He saw the sharp horizontal line of a windowsill, the wood splintered and faded grey by rain and sun. He was looking at the external wall of St. Jude's Asylum. His mind struggled to reconcile the image. Why? Why would this colossal instrument of astronomical observation be trained on the mundane wall of the adjacent structure? He adjusted the fine focus wheel just a millimeter, bringing the image into sickeningly crisp detail. He traced the field of view carefully. The windowsill ended abruptly, giving way to the dark interior of a window pane. On the glass itself, he could discern the hazy reflection of the internal room, a distorted shadow of a cot frame, a stack of worn books. Then his gaze locked onto the most specific detail. The window pane was cracked, the fracture running diagonally from the upper left corner, and where the crack met the frame, there was a crude, triangular patch of cardboard secured by yellowing adhesive tape. Elias's body went rigid, a cold wave of recognition, far more profound than the cold of the metal, washed over him, causing his stomach to clench violently. That was the 3rd window from the right, on the 2nd floor of the west wing. the window with the perpetual rattle when the wind blew. That was the window to his room. The Forbidden Observatory, the colossal Aetheria Tower, had its most powerful instrument trained, with painstaking scientific precision, directly onto Elias's bedroom window at St. Jude's Asylum. He pulled his eye back from the lens, stumbling slightly on the ladder rung. He stood there, trembling, his chest heaving, gulping in the heavy metallic air of the dome. The scale of the violation was impossible to absorb. It wasn't a casual peek. It was a fixed, deliberate observation. The telescope had not been moved in years. The immense gears of the mounting were locked, coated in a thick layer of dust. This setting was old. Someone at some time had fixed this instrument on his vulnerability and left it there, pointing through the darkness, an eye that never blinked. The urgency that had driven his climb evaporated, replaced by a profound, agonizing sense of exposure. He felt stripped bare, observed, quantified, even though he knew he couldn't possibly be seen in the darkness of the room now, or even when the observation was originally set. The sheer audacity of the aim implied a purpose beyond casual curiosity. Elias felt the desperate need to understand the who and the why. He had to move beyond the paralyzing shock. He looked around the massive structure of the telescope mount. The base of the equatorial mechanism rested on a thick slab of granite, deeply bolted into the floor below. Adjacent to the mount, secured to a small cantilevered shelf of dark mahogany, was a small leather-bound volume. An observer's log. He reached for it, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped it. The leather was dry and brittle, smelling powerfully of old paper and mildew. He opened the book. The pages were thick, creamy vellum, filled with meticulous script written in faded black ink. It was clearly the record of the observer, cataloguing astronomical readings, star positions, spectral analyses, transit times. He flipped past pages of incomprehensible scientific notation, looking for a date, a name, anything related to his specific window. The entries were heavily dated, spanning a period exactly 12 years prior, then stopping abruptly. He found a section of notes that were different. They weren't calculations, they were descriptive, almost narrative. They appeared to be observations recorded during the daytime, when the stars were invisible. Elias found the date that seemed to correspond to the period the instrument was last in use. He pressed the spine of the book flat, carefully focusing his eyes on the looping, precise handwriting. The entry was dated January 14th, 12 years ago. It read, Observation 237, Target, Secondary Structure Window 3R, 2F, Coordinates confirmed. Altitude, 18 degrees. Azimuth, 275 degrees. Conditions, clear, high cirrus. Target visible through gap in interior curtain. The internal scene is consistent with prior readings. The subject exhibits low motor activity, primarily confined to the perimeter of the crib structure. Elias stopped breathing. The word crib. He was 11. 12 years ago he had been an infant, recently arrived at St. Jude's. He flipped the page, desperate for context. Observation 238. Target. Window 3R. Note, lighting within the chamber is sporadic, contingent upon external movements of ancillary staff. The subject, designated Elias, displays a consistent pattern of interaction with the mobile apparatus suspended above the resting station. Noteworthy, the subject appears to fixate on the reflective qualities of the small carved wooden owl component. Elias's throat tightened, constricting painfully. The small wooden owl. He remembered the mobile vaguely, the only thing he had brought with him, the only object he owned that predated his memory of the orphanage itself. It had been broken years ago, lost to a clumsy cleanup, but he remembered the fragmented image of a tiny, carved wooden bird. The telescope wasn't aimed at a location, it was aimed at him. It had been aimed at him since he was an infant in that room. The horror intensified. morphing from simple dread into a terrifying, personalized invasion. This wasn't a distant scientist studying the sky. It was a deeply personal surveillance. He scanned the rest of the log. The entries continued for several more weeks, always focused on the subject, detailing the child's motor development, feeding schedule, and emotional responses to stimulus. It was clinical, detailed, and utterly devoid of warmth. Then on a page dated February 28th, the final entry appeared, written in a different hand, hurried and thick, tower sealed. Observation terminated under immediate notice from Director A. All instruments locked in situ. No further data collection authorized on Subject E. And that was it. The log stopped. The Aetheria Tower had been sealed, its powerful gaze frozen forever on the room of the orphan named Elias. He slowly closed the brittle logbook, the sound of the leather snapping shut loud and definitive in the cavernous dome. The air felt suffocating, heavy with the ghosts of these relentless, silent observations. Elias backed away from the instrument, stumbling over the catwalk grating. The urge to flee was overwhelming, but his legs felt weighted with lead. He had to understand the identity of the observer. He turned his attention to a small, dusty desk nestled in the shadow of the dome's revolving mechanism. It was cluttered with the detritus of scientific pursuit, empty bottles of ink, rusted calipers, and a pile of thick, unlabeled manila folders. He reached for the folders, pulling the top one free. The cardboard was stiff and cracked. He opened it carefully. Inside, there was another, far more recent photograph. It was a formal portrait taken perhaps 5 years ago. It showed the man from the original blurry snapshot, the man standing beside the telescope. But this image was sharp, professional. The man was older now, with kind, tired eyes and a distinctive prominent scar just beneath his left jawline. Below the photo, a brief printed label provided the identification. Dr. Julian Alistair Thorne, Chief Astronomer, Aetheria Project. Elias knew the name, though he hadn't heard it in years. Dr. Thorne. He was part of the history of the Asylum, part of the old guard, a recluse who lived and worked in the Aetheria Tower before it was suddenly closed. He was the subject of whispers, a genius who went mad, a philanthropist who disappeared. He looked back at the logbook. The precise, elegant script that described his infancy matched the professionalism of the portrait. Dr. Thorne had been the observer. But why this unrelenting focus on one single, vulnerable infant in a forgotten orphanage? The observations were scientific, not parental. There was no mention of adoption, kinship, or responsibility, only data collection on a subject. A sudden sound, a soft, dry scratching, pulled Elias out of his trance. It was faint, but unmistakable, a noise coming from the large metal access panel set into the granite floor, directly beneath the massive telescope mount. His fear returned, sharp and adrenaline-infused. He was not alone. The sound was too immediate, too tangible to be the wind or settling structure. He gripped the small iron pry bar, his knuckles white. He crept toward the access panel, his heart hammering against his ribs, deafening in the silence. He knelt, pressing his ear against the cold, thick metal. The scratching continued, muffled and irregular. It sounded like something trying to push its way out. Elias looked at the 4 heavy, bolted screws securing the panel. They were large, rusted hex heads, far too big to turn by hand or with his small pry bar. He had to leave. He had found the ultimate proof of the violation, and now he was seconds away from detection or confrontation. The stakes had suddenly skyrocketed from being grounded by Mrs. Prudence to something far more dangerous. He carefully placed the logbook back on the shelf, tucking the folder with Dr. Thorne's portrait back under the pile. He knew he could not risk carrying the evidence. It had to remain here, concealed in the place where the crime of observation had occurred. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. There was a low, resonant thump against the underside of the panel. Elias scrambled back to the catwalk. He retraced his steps to the maintenance hatch, moving with a speed born of pure, desperate terror. He eased himself through the narrow opening, rotating his body to minimize the inevitable scrape against the iron edge. He was outside again, suspended 3 stories above the frozen ground, clinging to the cold granite. The return descent was worse than the climb. His muscles were already spent, burning with lactic acid. His hands, stiff and aching, kept slipping on the slick, frosty stone. He relied solely on his memory of the gargoyle sequence, moving slowly, deliberately. His entire focus narrowed to the immediate tactile sensation of stone beneath his fingers. Once his left foot slipped on a patch of black ice near a joint, and he felt the sickening lurch of gravity asserting its claim. He caught himself instinctively, his arm wrenching against the joint, the pain momentarily blinding him. He gasped, muffling the sound against his shoulder. He clung there for 3 minutes, recovering his equilibrium, the intense pain serving as a brutal reminder of the consequence of error. He finally reached the base of the tower, dropping the last 5 feet to the frozen earth, the impact jarring his knees up into his ribcage. He lay there for a moment, winded and shaken, tasting the metallic fear on his tongue. He crawled beneath the wire fence, careful not to snag his already torn clothing. He was back on the asylum grounds. The relief was instantaneous but shallow, quickly replaced by the fear of crossing the open, moonlit expanse. He kept low, hugging the perimeter hedgeline, his eyes fixed on the distant outline of the main building. He reached the service door, performing the precise, slow-motion ballet of the lock mechanism in reverse. The rope was successfully retrieved, the bolt silently slid back into place. He was inside the warmth of the stairwell, breathing heavily, leaning against the cold oak. He slipped back into the dormitory hallway. The grandfather clock still ticked relentlessly. No lights were on. No doors were ajar. The silence was whole again, the asylum unaware of the profound trespass that had just occurred. Elias slipped back into his bed, beneath the thin, rough wool blanket. His body was shaking violently, a combination of the physical exertion, the cold, and the sheer psychological weight of the discovery. He lay staring up at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The telescope was aimed at him. He had broken into the structure, sought a distant truth, and found a truth so intimate and specific it felt like a physical assault. Why would a renowned scientist observe an orphan child with such obsessive clinical detail? And why was the project suddenly and violently terminated, resulting in the sealing of the entire structure? The answers were locked in the Aetheria Tower, and the key was in the mind of the deceased Dr. Thorne. Elias spent the remainder of the night shivering, mapping out the trajectory in his mind. The line of sight led from the eye of the scientific machine, through the dusty air, piercing the window pane with the patched cardboard, and terminating precisely where his crib had stood 12 years ago. The next morning arrived with the usual harsh demands of institutional routine, the smell of scorched oatmeal and the loud, unforgiving ringing of the wake-up bell. Elias moved through the motions of his day, dressing, eating, attending the dreary required study sessions, but his mind was elsewhere. It was locked in the oppressive silent dome of the tower. He needed more information, but the observatory was now impossible to breach again soon. His body was too battered, his luck too thin. He needed a mundane path to the past, and the only path he knew led to the one place in St. Jude's that held forgotten histories, the attic library. The library was a dusty repository of institutional records and forgotten donations. It was rarely used, mainly because the head librarian, a woman named Miss Vivian, was a stickler for decorum and quiet, and she disliked children intruding on her private kingdom of mildewed paper. Elias chose the time of greatest chaos, lunch period. He slipped away from the dining hall, while the noise of clattering cutlery and shouting children peaked. He ascended the steep, narrow back stairs that spiraled up to the attic floor. The library was a vast, low-ceiling space beneath the eaves. It smelled overpoweringly of dry paper and concentrated dust. Miss Vivian sat behind her massive mahogany desk, hunched over a ledger, her spectacles perched precariously on the end of her nose. Elias approached slowly. "Miss Vivian, I need to research the history of the asylum's auxiliary structures." Miss Vivian looked up slowly, her expression a mixture of annoyance and suspicion. "The auxiliary structures, Elias? Why?" "For my essay on local architecture," he lied smoothly, a skill honed by years of institutional survival. "The grant writer, Mr. Thompson, said it would impress the board if we showed engagement with the grounds." The mention of the board and grant writer was Elias's strategic masterstroke. It sounded official, bureaucratic, and therefore irresistible to Miss Vivian. She sighed, pushing her spectacles up. "Very well. The records concerning the Aetheria Tower are kept in the Architectural Records section, Shelf Gamma. Do not touch anything else, and do not, under any circumstances, make noise." "Thank you, Miss Vivian." He moved quickly to the designated section. The shelves were high and warped, filled with massive cloth-bound volumes. He located the relevant section, Architectural Records, 1880-1950. He pulled out the heaviest volume, wrestling it onto a small, dusty table. He focused his search on the period 12 years ago, when the tower was abruptly sealed, and his observations ceased. He flipped through blueprints and maintenance schedules until he found a detailed document titled Aetheria Tower, Closing and Repurpose Memorandum. The date confirmed the timing of the logbook's last entry. He read the text, tracing the faded words with his finger. Following the sudden termination of the Aetheria project and the subsequent passing of Dr. J.A. Thorne, the tower structure is to be immediately decommissioned and sealed under the instruction of the trustees. Reason for decommissioning: unforeseen ethical conflict of interest and misapplication of institutional resources. Note on contents: the primary instrument must remain in situ and locked at its current fixed coordinates. Under no circumstances is the instrument to be adjusted or moved, pending future review by the estate of Dr. Thorne. All associated notes and non-astronomical observation materials are to be removed and placed in private storage. Elias paused, fixed at its current coordinates. The board, or the trustees, or the estate, someone had intentionally preserved the alignment of the telescope. They knew where it was pointing. They knew it was aimed at his window, and they wanted it to remain there. The ethical conflict and the misapplication of resources provided a motive for the sealing, but not for the specific observation. Elias continued reading, turning the stiff, crackling page. He was looking for a link between Dr. Thorne and St. Jude's, something more than just a geographically close neighbor. He found it in an adjacent section, Trustees and Benefactors, 1930-1945. Dr. Julian Alistair Thorne was listed not as an employee, but as the primary sole benefactor of St. Jude's Asylum during that period. He had funded the entire institution for nearly 20 years. The realization hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. Dr. Thorne hadn't been merely a recluse scientist. He had been the financial backbone of the place that raised Elias. He controlled St. Jude's. If he had such control, why observe Elias secretly? Why the clinical distance? Elias pressed his hands flat against the cold, dusty wood of the table, trying to steady the wild, frantic beating of his heart. He scanned the donor records further, moving backward in time, looking for any mention of Elias's arrival. He found an attachment under a subheading marked Special Admissions. It was a single, typed sheet, heavily redacted but clearly identifiable as his own intake form. Subject name: Elias. Date of admission: January 5th, 12 years prior. Circumstance: relinquishment. Parents unknown. Special note: admission contingent upon ongoing non-intrusive observation utilizing the Aetheria Tower primary instrument. Funding agreement conditional on Subject E remaining at window 3R 2F. The truth assembled itself in Elias's mind, cold and sharp as fractured glass. Dr. Thorne had not just studied Elias, he had purchased his proximity. He had paid for the right to place an infant in a specific room, facing a specific window, and then used his powerful scientific equipment to watch that child day after day, week after week. But why? The emotional weight was crushing. He was not a beloved child, or even a random ward. He was a subject of a long, cold experiment funded by his own primary observer. Elias had to get out. Miss Vivian was starting to stir, shifting her weight heavily in her leather chair. He quickly, carefully replaced the record book exactly as he had found it. He walked slowly back to the librarian's desk. "That was very informative, Miss Vivian. Thank you." "Did you find what you needed, Elias?" she asked, her voice dry as parchment. "Yes. It seems Dr. Thorne was quite generous to the asylum." "He was," she said, nodding slowly, her eyes distant. "He was a good man, if a bit peculiar about his privacy. Always watching the sky, they said." Elias nodded, swallowing the irony of her statement. Always watching the sky. No, always watching him. He left the library and returned to the controlled chaos of the orphanage afternoon, a small, dark storm of revelation brewing beneath his surface composure. The feeling of being watched intensified, even though he knew the telescope was sealed, static, and blind in the daytime. The knowledge had changed the very nature of his room, transforming his small, secure space into a stage, a display case. That night, Elias did not sleep. He lay on his cot, staring at the window, the one with the cracked pane and the crude cardboard patch. In the dense, absolute darkness of his room, the window was an opaque void. He had to go back, not to change the telescope's aim, but to retrieve the single piece of evidence that could illuminate the emotional motive behind the clinical study, the logbook. He needed to look at those pages again, without the pressure of imminent discovery. He needed to find the humanity, the connection that must have existed, even buried beneath the scientific jargon. The preparation this time was faster, driven by a deeper reservoir of resolve. He knew the path, the smells, the sounds. He successfully breached the service door, crossed the grounds, and slid beneath the fence. The climb up the Aetheria Tower felt marginally easier, his body adapting to the memory of the sequence, the painful stretching of his muscles more familiar. He pulled himself through the maintenance hatch into the vast dome. The scene was identical to the previous night, the dancing dust motes, the smell of ozone, the looming cold presence of the great telescope, still aimed precisely at his window. Elias went straight to the mahogany shelf and retrieved the logbook. He carried it to the center of the catwalk, where the ambient light from the distant city filtered in, just enough to read. He turned directly to the final entry, the hurried script, "Tower sealed. Observation terminated under immediate notice from Director A. All instruments locked in situ. No further data collection authorized on Subject E." Elias focused on the note regarding Dr. Thorne's death and the ethical conflict. What was the conflict? He flipped back to the section of specific Elias observations, looking for an emotional shift in the language. He read the entries preceding the abrupt termination. February 25th. Subject E exhibits increased interaction with the window light source. Reaches for the pane during moments of sustained quiet. February 26th. Wind event. Window rattle pronounced. Subject E cried briefly, then fixated on the window again, displaying an unusual, rapid decrease in distress response. Suggests a possible learned association between agitation and external visual stimulus. February 27th. Subject E sleeping restlessly. Noted an object introduced into the window frame during staff check, a small blue velvet ribbon. Observed the infant's hands reaching toward the ribbon through the gap in the crib railing. Observation period extended. Elias stopped. The blue velvet ribbon, He remembered the story, a fragmented memory told by one of the older kinder wardens, long since retired. A story about the day he arrived. He had been delivered to St. Jude's in the dead of winter, wrapped only in a thin, tattered shawl. He was critically underweight, close to death. The matron at the time, a woman named Ms. Eleanor, had said that a doctor from the tower, Dr. Thorne, had rushed over, bringing special warming equipment and, strangely, a small, dark wooden box. The memory was fragmented, but the ribbon was key. Elias flipped to the very first page of the logbook, the initial setup entries. He saw the title page, Aetheria Project, longitudinal study on the early environmental impact of proximal stellar dynamics. Below that, a dedication. The dedication was written in a different, softer hand, scrawled beneath the formal title. It was almost obscured by an ink blot. Elias carefully held the page up to the pale moonlight, focusing. The scrawled note read, "To the memory of Eleanor." Eleanor. His mother's name. A wave of profound, cold clarity washed over him. The pieces clicked together with agonizing finality. Dr. Thorne was the sole benefactor, the man who paid for the observation, the man who was obsessed with an infant in the precise location of window 3R. Elias reached into the pocket of his shirt and pulled out the only non-institutional object he possessed, a tarnished silver locket, given to him years ago by an old caretaker who said it belonged to his mother, found nestled in the folds of his infant blanket. He had never opened it. It was sealed shut, the tiny clasp corroded by time and neglect. He used the sharp, thin edge of the pry bar he still carried. He wedged the tip into the infinitesimal seam of the locket and applied slow, steady pressure. The ancient silver finally groaned and the locket snapped open. Inside, there were two miniature photographs, faded almost to sepia. One was a woman, young and smiling, with eyes startlingly like his own. The second photo, filling the opposite side of the locket, was the man from the tower, Dr. Julian Alistair Thorne, the chief astronomer, the observer. Elias's world tilted on its axis. He stared at the face of the man who had watched him grow, the man who paid for his room, the man who meticulously catalogued his movements, the man who was listed as deceased shortly after the observation stopped. Dr. Thorne was his father. He was not merely a subject, he was the child of the obsessed, brilliant scientist who lived in the tower. The unforeseen ethical conflict was not scientific. It was the realization of paternity. The moment the clinician crossed the line into the parent, Elias's hands were shaking too hard to hold the heavy logbook. It slid from his grip, thudding heavily onto the catwalk grating, pages fluttering open. He knelt, picking it up, his eyes immediately drawn to the newly exposed page. It was an addendum, taped clumsily into the back of the book, written in the frantic, thick script of the final entry. It was a final note, clearly written by Dr. Thorne just before the tower was sealed, not an observation, but a confession. February 28th, late night. My funding is cut, my access rescinded. The board has found the personal nature of the study untenable. They demand separation. I cannot touch him. I cannot risk the exposure. They will use the tragedy of Eleanor against me, the failure to save her, the desperate, unscientific need to monitor the only thing she left behind. I cannot raise him. I cannot introduce a child to this silence, this obsession. But I cannot leave him unobserved, unrecorded. I must know he is safe. I must know he is growing. I have fixed the primary instrument. It is the last gaze I can give him. It is aimed precisely at his window. When the dome is sealed, its massive, unblinking eye will be locked forever upon the only light left in my world. Let the coordinates be a permanent record. Let the alignment stand as the silent testament to the love I was forbidden to show and the distance I was forced to accept. J.A.T. Tears, hot and immediate, streamed down Elias's face, tracing clean paths through the grime on his cheeks. They fell onto the brittle pages of the logbook, blurring the century-old ink. This wasn't surveillance born of cold science. It was a desperate act of forbidden love. His father, unable to be present, unable to touch him, had used the only means available to him, his powerful telescope, to ensure his son's continuous existence was observed, catalogued, and therefore validated. The instrument that had looked upon him was not an invasive eye, but a fixed, desperate, and silent gaze of paternity. The fixed coordinates were a declaration, not a data point. Elias understood now why the observatory was sealed, why the notes were removed, and why the telescope remained aimed at his window. The trustees had sealed away a father's love, deeming it an ethical conflict. He looked up at the immense cold instrument. It was no longer terrifying. It was magnificent and tragic. It was a monument to a sacrifice. He had to leave the book. The evidence of the connection had to remain here in the cold, silent heart of the Aetheria Tower, a secret museum of his own origin. He was the only one who now knew the truth hidden in the alignment. He replaced the logbook, tucked the locket securely into his inner pocket, and prepared for the final descent. He moved quickly, deliberately, fueled not by fear, but by a quiet, settled acceptance. He was not a subject. He was observed because he was loved in a way so intense and forbidden that it shattered the life of the observer. The descent was smooth, automatic. He slipped out of the tower and back across the grounds. When he finally returned to his room, pulling the thin blanket over his trembling body, he lay staring at the dark rectangle of his window. He closed his eyes, and instead of seeing the peeling wallpaper, he saw the image of the great telescope, frozen in time, its massive eye fixed on him, radiating not scientific scrutiny, but a permanent, silent vigil of paternal love, spanning the vast, lonely distance between the Aetheria Tower and the small, desolate room of the orphan named Elias. He was not abandoned. He was merely watched from a distance too great to cross, and in that realization, Elias found a profound, overwhelming sense of belonging that finally, completely, drove out the persistent, burrowing cold of St. Jude's Asylum. He finally slept, profoundly and deeply, for the first time in his 11 years, under the fixed, silent gaze of the Forbidden Observatory.